once every, every couple of weeks or so, we'll just put it like that will give us we need to send some messages. I've been meaning to do that, and it sort of slipped my mind. We talked about it early on, but I'm not going to copy everything. I'll just copy you and Neil. Oh, Neil's the. Very good question, though. Yeah, I've been a bit distracted the last few days. But the good thing is, oh, you're doing plus? So that's I was too. So that's a bit of a oh yeah. We're going to be so this way, we've already done it. We've not streamed it last week. Yeah, well, it's ready to go. So you can basically take it and go and to an LES. That's sort of the yes. To some extent, it sort of depends exactly. There's a there's a range. Just log into my office through to these about because as soon as they hit, I was like almost. Yeah, remote desktop. That's what oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
No. I assume that you were going to.
Yes, it's okay. I just got to make
No. I just thought I was going to make it up, so I was No. Yeah. No, it's important. Yeah.
Right, everybody, it is now 10:45. And we're now moving on to item number 9, which is the Whakaronga Housing Cash Flow Analysis, which will be presented by Stuart. So give you time to walk down the end, Stuart.
Morning all. This report's following on from the report you had last month on possibilities of building rental housing at Whakaronga. And so we were asked to do a cash flow analysis. Now it's never as easy as it should be because the answers aren't necessarily static. And so what I've attempted to do is make some assumptions based on fact and based on our interactions with people who are more expert than me at these things, and then that's what's in front of you. In terms of the flexibility, we've done some scenario analysis in attachment 3. Hopefully that's understandable. If it doesn't make sense, I encourage you to ask questions about it, but I'll leave it at that and open for questions.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. So I'm now open for questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Stuart. Just looking at the partnership opportunities on page 45, and I recognise that there needs to some further work to be done on that. But the three options, the three broad categories that have been included there, building companies, and government organisations, would there be a view of community organisations to also be engaged with to explore options for housing on this area? So, I mean, just as an example, we had the presentation from Homes for People, and they talked about assisted ownership and that sort of thing last week. Would there be those options within within the partnership opportunities that will be explored in the future?
The answer is absolutely. The reason they're not in this report is because this report was asked to be specifically about the building of market rental houses at Whakarongo. So they're not down as a partnership option in this report, but yes, definitely. And we've already been engaging in conversations with Housing New Zealand, for example. So the answer to your question is yes, there is opportunities.
Okay. Just to clarify, the recommendation that was put from the finance meeting was to include any partnership options as outlined. So is that not been interpreted as being requested for this report? Is that to be the subject of a further report?
I understood the recommendation fully. I spoke to the chair to seek some clarification, and there just wasn't sufficient time to do a good job of that, which is why this report's reasonably light on those partnership opportunities. If there is partnership opportunities to be further explored, then yes, we'll bring them back.
Thank you.
And I could just add to that, Councillor, there's been some conversations at the Housing Steering Group and with different housing providers around, so it's just a timing, and I see these two things going parallel together. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Stuart, for this report. I understand that timing issues and the ability to make assumptions is sometimes a bit difficult during COVID, but I do have a number of questions, if I'm allowed. So in 2.4, looking at the assumptions, you engaged with several property market professionals, which is great, but it appears that you've only received advice on the cost of building from only one building company. Why is that?
That's just a continuation from the previous report. That's the building company that we did liaise with. This is a cash flow analysis, so we weren't seeking tenders or absolute specifics, and we figured that the advice from them was sufficient to do that cash flow analysis on. This isn't a business case.
Okay. So looking at the costs of fully understand that, but looking at the costs of those buildings that's been mentioned here, is that what size of houses are we looking at there? Is that the average 120 to 140 meters squared, or is that smaller type of houses or bigger type of houses? Just as an indication of what that price actually means.
Again, we didn't get fully specific. What we talked about was the need to have, I'll use the mayor's terminology, non-cookie cutter 4-bedroom homes, to have purpose-built rental properties, either 2 or 3 bedrooms. One could assume that they're slightly smaller than you would build for an individual building their own house. So the assumptions are based on half being 2-bedroom and half being 3-bedroom. So 20 of each.
Okay. So then, so if you're looking at that, could we also then make the assumption that if we had smaller houses, that would actually be cheaper than the 375? Okay.
You can, because it is an assumption, and in the scenarios on Appendix 3, we've put some cheaper options to show what that financial position looks like as well.
Okay. If we did, if the council decided that this is the kind of route that we want to go down, and we started building terrace-style houses where 2 houses were joined on a smaller footprint, a bit like a smaller version of the Papuia project, would that save us money on things like consent fees and builders fees and fencing? Because I've heard that those kind of property developments actually save about 100K in building costs.
Bryce is making faces at me. He's much more better placed to answer that question than me, so I'll seek his advice.
Sorry.
Good morning, councillors. One of the challenges that was originally put was around the idea of pepper potting. So, when we look at things like the Papioia complex, one of the ways that we've been able to cut down costing is by looking at more of a block rental type approach and looking to do blocks of units. If we're trying to be pepper potting, that does limit the opportunity to be doing that, but there are some opportunities that we could potentially retain two sections next to each other to look at some kind of typologies. But as Stuart mentioned, for the purpose of an assumption and being able to do cash flowing, that wasn't explored. It was just a pretty sort of mainstream 2-3 bedroom modest type home.
Okay. And so I guess also if we're looking at something like the Papioia project, and that we've been recently successful in our shovel-ready grants on the Papioia project, which provided an extra 4.7 million to support us in building 28 units. By my calculation, that works out to be around 168, say, thousand per unit. So I acknowledge that's a 1-bedroom unit on that kind of area. But is there wiggle room in negotiations with potential builders between 170K for a 1-bedroom house and that 375K as well?
The answer is we weren't asked to look at that. We were asked to look at market rental properties, 40 of them, pepper potted throughout the subdivision. So Papio is quite a different proposition. It's social housing. It's all on one section of land. There's no contributions, for example. So I don't think it's an accurate reflection to compare. You're comparing apples with oranges, and we weren't asked to look at that, so I can't answer that question.
Okay, that's fair enough. I also have a question around the assumption of the 3.4% as an interest rate. From my understanding, banks are often happy with investments that result in tangible assets, such as land and property. I know that my brother just got a home loan and his interest rate was 2.9%. Does council have the kind of buying power to have a lower interest rate than the 3.4?
The answer is right now, yes, we do. And again, there's some scenarios with cheaper options, cheaper interest rates in scenario 3. But the 3.4 represents a long-term interest rate. So if you build these things, you're paying the loan over a 30-year period. And it would be pretty presumptuous to assume we could borrow the money over a 30-year period for the price we can borrow it at right now. Right now is unusually cheap.
Okay, so I understand that. So then looking at that 30-year period, is it possible to have a loan of longer than that 30-year period? Because, I mean, I know, just as an example with my house is 60 years old and it's still a house and it's still land that has, increased in value during that time. So is there a possibility for council to have a longer term loan rather than the 30-year usual amount? Because usually when you have a 30-year home loan, that's because realistically a human has 30 years to kind of pay off the mortgage. But if you're looking at council, is that a possibility?
It's a very broad question and relates to council's financial strategy. And so I assume if council's willing to change its financial strategy, then you could change those loan periods. It won't make any difference to the price, is the short answer. Whether your loan's 50 years or 100 years, there'll be less principal being repaid each year, but the interest cost will be the same. And so the answer is I wouldn't, normally council's financial strategy is to borrow over the life of an asset. I wouldn't propose that a housing development like this is a good reason to change that philosophy.
But in saying that, the life of the asset of a house would be longer than 30 years, wouldn't it?
The question's been answered, Councillor.
Okay, fair enough. So then looking at the letting fee of 6%, Is that if we outsourced the management of these rentals to a property management company, or is that if we had, because basically what happens with the current rentals that we already own, and do we pay staff to manage these? And, you know, if we added a further 40 houses to the portfolio, would it be more cost effective to increase their staff hours as opposed to the 6% letting fee?
I think you have options in that case. 6% is a good rate. So normal commercial rates are actually higher than that, around 8%. So 6 was a bulk discount, if you want to call it that, for council being a good customer, I suppose. The reality is everything costs money, right? Resources cost money, and whether you outsource that or use your own staff, I don't think the cost would be significantly different.
Okay. Sorry, I think that I've got. So if we're looking at all of these assumptions that I've just mentioned, is it possible that building 40 rental properties to add to council's assets could be cheaper and could be less damaging to cash flow and could potentially become cost neutral if we made a few jiggles here and there, and could potentially be a good investment for the city? Is that a possibility?
I don't expect. I think you've got to take the analysis is here, and it's up to councillors to make that decision. And if there's information missing that you need to know to get you to a decision, then. So I don't expect you to answer that question, Stuart.
Cool, thank you. I'll leave it at that.
But I understand where you're coming from. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Stuart and Bryce. I'm just wondering, in terms of the big picture here, we haven't taken into account any increase in the value of the asset, have we?
No.
So, so we've looked at what we would have to borrow to do this and what the ongoing costs would be, but we haven't looked at the other side of the ledger, which is the increase in the value of the asset to council. No,
and I've been asked this question prior to this meeting as well. I don't think we can because A, I'm not an economist. B, I can't guarantee houses are always going to go up in value. And C, we weren't asked to, is the short answer.
Okay. So if council, with its ability to access low interest rate borrowing, can't make a development like this financially viable, who can?
Yeah, I fully anticipated this question. And the short answer is, good question. But people are out there doing it, and I guess it's people with equity and people willing to take risk. And your previous question probably alludes to who's doing it right now, right? Those who are risking that the value is going to go up, and that's where they're making their money. We were asked to prepare a cash flow analysis of what it costs. Mm-hmm. If you added the land to those numbers, you're looking even much worse, right? So it's a good question. Who can afford to build a house and put people in it from a rental perspective? I'm not an economist. It's quite rightly pointed out. I'm not at pains to answer that, but I'm guessing people willing to take risks and who have equity already in the bank.
Thank you.
Stuart, can I just follow on with a question? Because one of the lines in there, you've got a line there for loan repayments, and a lot of investors will do interest only for 2 or 3, could be 2 or 3 years to get them through over. So that's not an expense. That's actually increasing our asset by repaying loans. So if you actually take those figures out, it doesn't look as bad, does it?
In some cases, you're right. However, being a council, we have a financial strategy of funding our operations as they fit. And so, we're asked to do a cash flow analysis. This is what you've got in front of you, not a balance sheet analysis necessarily. So I think it's unfair to take them out because the reality is we're not likely, I wouldn't suggest that we borrow on an interest-only loan for this type of investment. And so from a cash flow investment, we still have to pay that money out. So I guess I stand by it being an adequate representation of what we were asked to do.
Oh, I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying that that's not an expense. It's increasing your value of your asset and your equity into the asset.
Except that you're not making enough revenue to fund that principal repayment without asking ratepayers to subsidise it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr. Armstrong.
Stuart, just one question. I guess the comment around not including any uplift in property value is one thing. And I've understood your comments around financial flexibility, but when you think about this, I guess if you build 40 houses, at any point in time, you can choose to sell or partnership, dilute your ownership in those houses. So just any thoughts or comments when you were pulling this analysis together on how you thought about reflecting that financial flexibility?
Yeah, and I can see why you've asked the question, because it's not represented in what you see in front of you. There are assets you can sell. This is true, absolutely. And I guess my biggest concern is around the opportunities council has in terms of its borrowing cap, and for that purpose, I see that being almost a bigger issue than the year-to-year cash flow. I mean, there's no easy answer to that question. I can see why you've asked it. Yes, you have some flexibility. They are assets. They can be bought. They can be sold. Assuming they make a reasonable investment, you can assume people will be willing to invest with you. I can leave it at that, I guess. Yeah, I don't. Hopefully that's answered your question, but I think the point you're trying to make is there flexibility around the balance sheet around doing things slightly differently to exactly what's presented here? Of course there is, but you know, we were asked to put together a cash flow analysis assuming we built and rented out 40 houses, which is what you have in front of you.
Thank you, Stuart. Are there any further questions? There being none, so you may step down. So we will go to the recommendation, and I'm happy to move the recommendation. Have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Naylor. And I'll just make a comment. The reason I asked for these financial analysis was because of the issue that we have got in the city of not being able to find rental properties for, you know, prospective tenants, and because of the increased development that's coming into our city, and definitely the queues waiting to get rental properties. I don't see it possibly as a long-term investment, but it's something that I thought perhaps council might be interested in getting us over a hump. So perhaps we look at investing in the first, getting them off the ground, rented, and then perhaps selling them later on if the financials and the cap worked for that period. But my key reason is around the economics of the city, because I think we're stalling some of the investment in our city by not having enough rental housing. At this stage, I have got the figures in front of me. They are ballpark figures. There's ways and means of manipulating figures. If you take like the loan repayments out, they don't look so bad. If we have a look at the interest rates we can get at the moment, we could get 1% interest rates. There's a whole lot of things that if you really wanted to make this work, you could. But it would depend on council's policy and where we want to go. And I don't think we're in the right space at the moment to make that decision on these facts and figures. So what I'm suggesting, I'm happy to move this. We've received it, and that we can go away, analyse what we've been given, and certainly with our portfolio group as have a look at it. And then if we feel as we've got the support, or there's a willingness to change the policy, then we'll come back to council or not come back to council as required. So that's where my thinking is on this today. So are there any other comments? Thank you, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Stuart, for the report. I have been keeping an open mind about this. I'm fully committed, as I'm sure everyone else is, to looking at what council can do in the best possible way to assist the availability of appropriate housing in the city. And I think it has been a frustration to me and others that perhaps though that lower cost or the more affordable or the smaller housing, the availability of that housing doesn't appear to have been provided through the current market. And so I think it's definitely a sensible thing for us to explore what we can do. At this point, and with the information in front of me, I'm not convinced that us becoming property developers is the best way of that market being addressed, but I'm still retaining an open mind about that. Looking at the fact that it would add 23 million to our debt levels, and we would have to be subsidising it based on the information in front of us. I think that the fact that the parcels of land have been made smaller will assist. I think there's some mechanisms that this council is doing to enable that, but I think just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's sensible, and I think there may well be other ways of us achieving the same result through partnerships with other organisations, and my preference at this point would be for officers to continue to explore those partnerships and other avenues to achieve the same result, but perhaps without putting the level of burden onto ratepayers. I'm not convinced that council building the houses is actually the most cost-effective way of those houses actually being provided in the first place. So that's where I sit at the moment, but certainly useful information in front of us to help inform our thinking, and I'm happy to hear the officers report back that those conversations will continue with other partners.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the officers for the report. And I think just to take Councillor Johnson's question around, well, who is building these homes? I mean, I think it's clearly there is an issue there. It is hard to make this work, and so I really say this not only as the mayor but as also the chair of the city's housing forum. That this is more than just economics, and I mean I'm a former business person, so I know that's a big part of any business case. But there are social health and livability issues here as well, and the chair is right in the sense that it's bigger than just housing, because it's a lever for the city's economy, for prosperity, and we know that there's leakage all around us in terms of people that come into the city to work and enjoy the benefits of our city, but they aren't ratepayers, because they can't get a house here because it's hard. We know that there's a bigger group of primary landowners, as there are in all cities, and there has been land banking going on in the city for more than 2 decades. So how are we going to break that? I think at least we should be looking at setting aside these 40 sections, and then, as Councillor Naylor said, possibly looking at some other partners. I think that could work. To give you an example, around the Housing Forum, the Roading Alliance are looking for houses. They've been to us and reported to Councillor Denison's Infrastructure Committee about buying homes, but actually sections, because they wanted to build. They didn't want to cannibalise the existing stock. Housing New Zealand's another one. Rangatane, your CHIPs, your community housing providers like Homes for People, and actually commercial partners as well. Wallace Development and their Soho group, which are providing some of this rental type housing. Council doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting, but we certainly need to be an enabler. I wouldn't go as far as calling us a developer, but we do have a role to play. And I think ratepayers and residents do understand that. There is some problems in the city. There has been no rentals built for some time. And I can't see, we're just not getting indications of that changing. So how do you break that mould? I think this could be a way of doing it without risking council's finances. So I would, in fact, I'll go as far, Madam Chair, as perhaps putting a motion up that we ask the officers to look at other options around partnerships, because if we don't give them some indication, are they going to do that work?
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, we have already got that in from the last meeting, so.
Okay, well, as long as that, because I mean, and rightly so, the CFO just said, these are the directions you've given me, and we've got a baseline, and we know it's hard, but if we're going to want to continue on this journey, how are we going to make it work?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made so far. If you look at this report, it is a bit of a scary proposition. It does feel like quite a lot of money, but that's based on the assumptions that is in this report. I'm concerned about Whakarongo, not because of the money that we would need to invest in it, but because of the missed opportunities for our community and for council in the long run if we don't. There is building happening in the city, and we heard from Homes for People last week that a lot of the homes being built are actually the more expensive 4 and 5 bedroom homes, and what is needed is the 2 and 3 bedroom homes. They're the ones in high demand. What's also needed is rental properties. They're the ones in high demand. This report says that one builder we consulted with is not interested in building rental properties. And if developers are not interested in providing rental homes, I feel that council needs to step up and fill the gaps, like we've done historically. And, you know, looking at partnerships is an option, but also council building is also an option. The report says that the builder builders might be interested in the house and land package, where council provides the land, the builder provides the house, and packages are sold to market and profit is split 50-50. But if we're looking at land being 240K and a house being 375K, that's at least 615K to buy a house in Palmy. Again, there is huge demand for houses and rentals in the more affordable price brackets, and 615K isn't that. There is 550 clients on the Housing New Zealand waiting list in our area. Accompanying those clients is 100 children in emergency housing. That is unacceptable. And so I feel that we need to be doing all that we can as a council to try and alleviate some of this pressure. And a lot more investigation needs to happen, and we're not quite there yet. So I would welcome an opportunity to look harder at these figures and seeing if we can actually make it work through the housing portfolio, either through the housing portfolio or further reports or whatever it is that's needed to actually dive deeper into these figures and see what we can do to help alleviate the housing crisis in Palmy.
Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My observation would be I find the information helpful, but not quite getting to the nub of the issue. And perhaps when the officers are thinking about different opportunities, partnership opportunities, when we're looking at quite cash flows and options with different cash flow profiles, it's helpful to be able to bring that back to a dollars of today value so that you can then compare across options. And to some of the comments made earlier around taking a view on interest rates or taking a view on property prices, the truth of the matter is that you're never going to get that right, but if you try and range bound those outcomes, then at least that informs the decision process. So my suggestion, my comment would be, when this does come back, if it comes back with that further analysis, that it is framed to discount different cash flow profiles back to something that we can compare, and that it does range bound where there are critical economic assumptions that we could get wrong, so that we know broadly where that sits. Okay. So just some suggestions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was not going to comment, but then just following some of the questions, I think this is the report that we asked for. We can't fudge the numbers or tweak them to convince people that an opportunity like this is cheaper or than it actually is. The figures are the figures. If we want to invest and build in rental properties, then this is a realistic figure of what we would be looking at. We've got a really proud track record of building so far, and investing in social housing. And if we're going to move into the building of rental properties, then obviously that's a decision that we would make, but we would need to own the decision and own the figures that come with that, own what that, the cash flow is going to look like, because that's the reality of it. When we invest in people, there is a different type of return than when we invest in other assets. I would just say that I wouldn't be interested in a conversation around this where we started off by saying we could sell property in future, we could sell housing in future. I think that's a really dangerous game to set up for any future council to have to make a decision knowing that something was set up for them with the intention of selling housing down the line, when I would say that, across local government, that's something that we have seen, but that's something that we've stood quite firm on and really showed a lot of leadership around increasing stock rather than decreasing. But I'm happy to explore this further. I think that my biggest comment would be around the fact that we just need to make sure we take our time. There are other opportunities. There are other spaces that we could work with around the city, and there are pieces of work happening. And so, actually, if we wanted to look at building, I appreciate that we have the land here, which we could, as the Mayor said, we could tag that and come back to it. We don't have to commit ourselves right now, but we also just need to be aware that there is a conversation happening around the Huia Street Reserve. There are conversations happening around bowling greens and what those could look like in future. And there are other council spaces in the city that that we just need to ensure that if we're talking about investing in a particular area, that we actually have taken stock of the whole city to say that actually, if we are going to spend some money in this space, is this the best place for it? And if we are building houses which, appreciating that they are going to be, they could be market rentals, that do we want people to encourage people to live closer to the CBD, or do we want to allow space further out? Those are just considerations we need to make. But recommendation on the screen to receive this, more than happy to do that today.
Are there any further questions? I'd just like to wrap up with one comment, and the reason I'm looking at Whakaronga first, and I know that we've got other areas, but you mentioned Huia Street, and that's under a submission process, and we haven't made any decisions on that. And all the other areas that we've got earmarked, you're talking 2, 3, 4 years before we could develop those. And the rationale behind this one is that we could be selling and building on this within a year. It's an urgent need now, not, well, if we're in trouble in 3 and 4 years' time and we've still got this problem, we haven't done our job as a council. So that's my only comment around why Whakaronga. So we will now go to the vote. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
Thank you. So that is carried unanimously. We now move on to item number 10, which is the quarterly report, and thank you, Stuart. And Andrew, are you joining? Thank you.
Presenting to you our final quarter report for 2020. From a financial perspective, we've ended the year with a very small operating surplus of $72,000 favourable to budget. Pretty good, I think, given what we've just been through. So you'll be aware in February we were sitting on about a $2.7 million surplus. We think as officers, if life had carried on as normal and COVID hadn't affected us like it did, we probably would have ended the year somewhere around $3.5 million in surplus. So you could do a reverse engineering on the maths and suggest that COVID perhaps cost us around $3.5 million from an operating perspective last year. And I think you'll find the impacts continue this year. And, you know, given we all thought we were, well, personally, I thought we were heading for another lockdown on Friday. It's not over yet. Heather quite rightly points out, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I don't want to create any kind of false sense of security from a COVID point of view, but, you know, as a council, perhaps it cost us $3.5 million. We perhaps got off fairly lightly compared to some of our other council colleagues, and something we should be reasonably grateful about, I suspect. The big areas affected by the COVID story were in revenue particularly. In this facility, arena, we cancelled a tattoo. We didn't charge for parking for 2 and a bit months. All added up to a reasonable amount of money. On the cost side, there's a reasonable amount of money spent on a direct response from an organisation perspective. We set up and we run an EOC. We undertook a large welfare response, much of which was funded from central government, but not all. Significant costs came from staff leave liabilities. So people were not able to go on holidays as per regular. And, you know, if we go into a lockdown and a similar thing happens again, the similar story will repeat. You know, we spent quite a bit of money on consultants and the like in terms of a catch up from the building and planning consenting process, because we're still struggling to get staff in those areas. We should acknowledge that the result was helped by significant interest savings. Without them, we'd have a slightly different story to be explaining to you this morning. The reason I bring that up is A, to give context, and B, because I don't expect that opportunity will present itself in the current financial year, given that we think the capital program is pretty deliverable this time around. So just something to acknowledge. From a CapEx delivery perspective, obviously we were quite badly affected. We're very pleased with our capital renewal spend ending at 90% of what was budgeted. A lot of focus and effort was put into that, particularly in June. You'll notice capital new was not so good. It took a bit of a hit, let's be fair. The world kind of stopped from that perspective. So we finished the year with a net debt of 142 million. The astute amongst you will notice that that's exactly the number we used in assuming our opening debt for the budget. I can assure you that's a fluke and not what we intended. We're about to ask, part of this recommendation is to ask for approval of carry forwards of 3.8, so one would assume the debt level should be lower than that. 2 reasons really why the debt's a bit higher than we expected. One is central government and our response was to pay our creditors very, very quickly. So we're still undertaking weekly payment runs, so we're still paying all our creditors within 7 days rather than waiting till the 20th of the month to pay them. So that's about $1.5 million of cash out the door that we wouldn't normally have. Rates collection was not as badly affected as we thought. We had a number of people call us to talk about rates payment plans. The difference in collectible between 30th of June 2020 and 30th of June 2019 is about $450,000. So from just over $1 million to just over 1.5 owing in rates, which I think is a pretty good news story from a city's health perspective. And the other thing is there's a bunch of revenue, particularly around the EOC recoveries for that welfare work that we did that just wasn't received in cash by the 30th of June. And so I see no need to panic about the debt levels. But yeah, those with a financial mind will be wondering why we're asking for another 3.8 million in capex when we don't have the capacity and the debt. That's why. In terms of carry forwards, just wanted to talk briefly about that. We're asking for carry forwards to be approved of $3.8 million. This compares to about 4.1 for last year. What we've presented to you appears in 4 tables to add a bit of clarity around what we're talking about. So the first 2 tables are very much programs where we anticipated we wouldn't be finished in time, and we made an assumption at what the carry forward amount might be. And as the year's finished and we've got certainty about what our spending has been, we're reflecting them up and down as appropriate in terms of what we're looking for in the budget. Table 3 is request for funding where we had not budgeted as part of our annual budget, mainly because we thought we'd be done by the 30th of June. And turns out life's not as perfect as we like it, and we weren't. And you'll notice there's a particularly big one in there being the Streets for People, request to carry forward of about 1.4. You'll also notice looking out the door that that's finished. So that table 3 is really work that's already been committed. It's already been done, or very shortly about to be finished. There's contracts in place already. So we'd be in a bit of a pickle if you didn't like that one. Table 4 is also where a number of projects where we hadn't budgeted a carry forward, but we think it makes sense to complete this year. So they are a combination of things where, in terms of getting the capital number down to a reasonable number in the budget, programs were pushed out another year or two, and we think it's prudent to bring them forward and do them now. So example being the Ashurst pathway, for example, where there's a lot of public pressure to get that done. Or things we thought we would get done by the 30th of June and didn't anticipate needing a carry forward that just didn't happen and don't yet have a commitment. So there's some choice aspect on that. We're hoping you agree with us that it's a good idea to carry all of that capital work forward for the progression of the city, and obviously free to take questions on some of that stuff. 2 weeks ago, we were entirely confident on our ability to deliver the entire program on time and in full. And as of today, sitting here, we still feel that way. However, my comments from earlier around COVID, it being an uncontrollable risk from some extent, put that at risk, and I just wanted to throw that idea out there. We are still confident, all things going well, that we can deliver a $74 million program this year, and Tom's nodding his head, which is a good sign. Yeah, over to Andrew.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Stuart. So Stuart talked a lot about the impact of COVID. I'll just briefly summarise where we are with the performance measures. And again, COVID had an impact on those. We met 3/4 of the target, were all achieved, and more than half of the remainder were not achieved due to COVID. And that was mostly due to things like venues being closed or events not being able to go ahead. Of the 10 targets that weren't met and that weren't due to COVID, due to a range of things like staff vacancies, unforeseen expenses, and traffic accidents. And again, some of those traffic accidents are not wholly due to council's roading, due to speed, alcohol, a whole lot of different factors. Thank you.
Anything else to add? Open for questions. Okay. First up, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Stuart and Andrew, for your comprehensive report, and I suppose, first of all, well done on getting through to this stage. My question's around external funding, and you may be able to answer this. I'm just unsure, but it's worth socialising. And although I know nothing is signed or sealed, there is some significant possible income coming via Shovel Ready or Three Waters, possible infrastructure. How will that affect council's position? I know a lot of it may be deferring debt, but just would like your comment on that.
Absolutely, it helps, and it is worth socialising. There's no hiding from the fact that any external funding takes pressure off the citizens of Palmerston North from a ratepayer perspective. That's the reality, and so I think it creates definite opportunities. Some of them might be new opportunities where funding streams are freed up to do new things, and some of them may be being able to do work that the budget would otherwise constrain. And so I think it's a really positive thing. I think we need to keep pushing harder and harder and harder to get as much external funding as we can from an organisation that's offering it. And so, yeah, definitely worth verbalising. Every cent helps improve the lives of the citizens of the city. That's reality.
Thank you.
Councillor Harpeter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for your report. Just your comments around paying the creditors weekly. I think it's a great practice in these times. Just how long do you think you'll continue to do that?
For the time being, for the foreseeable future. We were written to by central government to ask us to do that, and we were pleased to be able to say we'd already figured that out for ourselves. So we don't have an end date on that at the moment.
Okay. Second question is around FTE headcount. Just wondering, increased quite substantial. Someone can give me a comment on, it's on page 125, why it's increased so much.
It's really an equation, a more complicated equation than just saying FTEs have increased because we wanted to. We're trying to move away from using consultants and contractors and the like and temporary employees to do things that full-time staff could otherwise do. You'll note in last year, for example, the consultant spend is still quite high. And so there is an attempt organisationally to structure the organisation in such a way that we have the skills in-house we need to deliver the resources and services that we're trying to deliver. And so our approach since Heather arrived, I suppose, is to structure the organisation in a way that positions us to best deliver the services. And that has meant more staff in the short term and less spending on consultants.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, there were also, and I think it's noted in here, a number of vacancies, and we have carried as an organisation an extraordinary number of vacancies for a long time. We are now finding, and I can't speak of the last 2 months, but certainly before that, we were finding that we were getting a number of those filled. People are attracted to the city as a place to live, and I think that has changed quite markedly over the last few years. And so you'll see that rather than carry those costs externally, we will always, I would not like Stuart's comments to mean that suddenly there will be no consultants. You will always augment your staffing numbers with the skills that you do not carry internally, because the cost of carrying those for specific jobs is simply too high. So there will be roles where we could just simply not compete with the external market, and we would look to bring those people in for a role, because actually it's cheaper to do that than carry headcount, and we are always making those types of adjustments and decisions.
So just to follow up, thank you for that. That's a great explanation. Just, has the wage bill gone up as a result of the headcount gone up?
Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Stuart and Andrew. Couple of questions. The first one is about the increase in rates owing. Are you able to say whether that's predominantly residential or commercial?
I'm not able to say with any great accuracy. I do know there was some businesses, particularly hotels, who had contacted us. I don't have the absolute specifics, but it wasn't a huge volume of ratepayers, less than 100.
Okay, thank you. And then in your comments, Stuart, you mentioned about the financial cost of the lockdown. And can you comment on our ability as an organisation to respond to any further lockdowns?
Yeah, it's the short answer is it's going to be difficult. We don't have Heather's reaching for her microphone. I don't know if she wants to comment, but we had financial wriggle room for the last lockdown is the answer, and mainly because of those interest savings. And that's why I made the comment before that I don't think we can expect that to repeat. We don't know what the lockdowns are going to look like, and we don't know what their duration is going to be, and we're going to have to use Heather's word, pivot, to deal with them as best we can, is the short answer. We don't. Last year, perhaps we were fortunate in that we had some wriggle room, and probably fortunate that a large proportion of our income comes from rates rather than other sources. If you look at a council like Auckland or Christchurch, you will have seen in the media that the large proportions of their income is external to rates, and they're really suffering. We're not suffering to the same extent, but we don't have the wriggle room that we had last year.
So,
sorry, our CEO would make a comment.
I can also add to that in two ways. If your question, Councillor Johnson, is around financial ability, then Stuart's absolutely right. We certainly do not have the wriggle room. We have a very tight budget. I've emphasised this a couple of times to council. There isn't spare money in there. So if we have increased costs, if we have revenue that we're not getting, absolutely it's going to be an issue. We still don't know from a government perspective whether the funding that was available last time to support the community would be available in another and another lockdown. So, these are all questions in terms that we're dealing with. In terms of preparedness as an organisation to deal with it, we are working through those plans with haste, with both Patrick and Chris running an EOC and business continuity plan. And so from an organisational preparedness, we would certainly be a lot more prepared than we would be, than certainly we were last time. But also a note of caution, and my apologies earlier that I had to leave the meeting for an unexpected appointment. But in terms of well-being, you are dealing with people that have now been through this. There was an enormous pressure on the organisation. They're going into something like that again and trying to keep as much of business as usual running in order to kind of meet our plan for the year. It is going to be a real challenge, both in terms of actually getting that work done and actually in terms of people's wellness, and we are acutely aware of that.
Thank you. Chris, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, maybe I just add a bit of a comment. So obviously there'd be some concerns about our ability to respond to the welfare needs of the community, which of course is our key role in the Emergency Operations Centre. And it's not all bad news. So yes, the extra $30 million fund that the government provided last time for territorial authorities to be able to provide support to food banks as an example, it's not there. So we don't have that. So what we're doing now is working out how we work without that. But the good news is that MSD has been given a lot of support over the last few months. So they've got big buckets of money to help support the food banks and have doled out a lot of cash to help improve their capability and capacity to respond. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is that there's also that $36 million resilience fund that we talked about a couple of weeks ago that's there. So one of the things we're doing as an organisation is working with all of their key stakeholders out in the community, encouraging them to go and apply for that money to make sure that all of those other agencies are well set up to respond. So while we may not have the money to support some of those things, the money will be there, hopefully from MSD. So our role may still be a key coordination role, and in some cases supporting the immediate needs of people. So the Act allows us to claim some money back from the government, and that's the money that we need to respond to the immediate needs. So it's not providing people with groceries for their week, but it is basically if there is immediate need, like someone desperately needs something now, we can claim that back. What we can't claim back is our internal costs associated with doing that. So our costs of our vehicles, the cost of our staffs, any of the overheads, we can't claim that. So that's the thing that we're going to have to be incredibly careful with. But we are trying to set ourselves up in a way that we can still meet those needs of the community, but without incurring those costs internally to PNCC as we go along. So, and we've got a little bit of time to do that. I'm actually popping out for a meeting at 1 o'clock with MSD just to work through some details, and we will get those processes right.
Thank you, Chris. Any further questions, Councillor?
Well, yes, just to follow up from that, and thank you all for the very comprehensive response. I just wonder, in the light of that, the very tight financial situation, as well as the potential strain on the organisation, if we need to be considering in our long-term plan discussions having some kind of contingency for dealing with COVID, because it's not going away as a one-off. I think we can be reasonable in predicting that it's going to be around for, the short to medium term, and whether or not we need to actually have some contingency funds to deal with potential lockdowns in the future in the long-term plan. I'd appreciate a response either now or at some later point. Thank you.
I think that's probably an excellent idea and one that we can build into our discussions.
Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, and well done on the NG result, given the challenges. My questions were also around page 125, the FTE count, which appears to have increased by over 10%, and I recognise that's vacancies and new positions, but 10% or 61 FTE from June 19 to June 20 is more than what there was for the 3 previous years. What my question is, I guess this is information as elected members that we only get insight into retrospectively because it's considered an operational issue. It's not a part of our planning in terms of information that's included in annual planning or annual budget information. So we only really find out about it once it's happened and we look at the report on what's happened in the last year. But I was just wondering if it would be useful to have some level of an understanding of what we're anticipating going forward in terms of that FTE increase. I'm assuming it's not going to be at that same level. Can't maintain a 10% increase each year, obviously. But what would we be looking at going forward? Or what would we expect to see there in a year's time when we see the reporting?
Who's answering that?
First of all, can I just preface this with, we are doing a lot more than we were doing 3 or 4 years ago. So I think to say we're not going to see 10% increases in the future predicates the fact that we wouldn't do any more, that you need people to implement. And of course there are economies of scale, and we will, and I certainly do apply that, and there is very rigorous oversight of any new position that comes in, because we have very limited budgets, and what we are doing is working to an operational budget for the year, which has been signed off by council, and so I'm doing that. And so we are implementing that. But it would be fair to say that I would not like the comment by Councillor Naylor just to stand that we won't see increases in the future. I can't predict that. It would depend on the amount of work that was required, the balance between whether it be consultants, how hard people were to get, all sorts of factors that come into that.
I'm just wondering if I could have my question answered, though. The question wasn't around the percentage increases in the future. What the question was what would we be looking to expect that increase to be within the next year? So June 2021, what can we expect?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head. I would need to get that and come back to you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for the report. Just three things I wanted to check in on. The first was around the catalyst projects in the stormwater area. There is a reference to a Haimana towards Healthy Waterways program. That's the first time I noticed that, and just didn't know what that was and what it was aiming to achieve.
That refers to an operating program which is around citywide monitoring of our open streams and drains. So we've given it that title because we're collaborating quite closely with Rangitani and developing not only cultural but also science-based monitoring. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Will the monitoring of that be, I guess, coming to council, or will it be publicly available in some way that we can be feeding into an understanding of the health of our urban streams?
Yeah, at the moment, we're developing the framework for that. So, the monitoring locations and frequencies, and so once that becomes a program of work, obviously, if there's a stream of data, we'll be sharing that. Yep, more widely. Yep.
Great, thank you. Second question that I have might end up looping back around to the same source of an answer, but just trying to understand around the language that we're using around the road safety reporting, and it was both in the report and in the verbal comment around pointing to a lot of the external factors or things that are less directly in our control that influence the challenges we're facing around road safety, and just wanted to have some assurance from council staff around our level of ownership of that KPI and how we might be responding.
It's a very difficult area. As I've reported previously to council, there has been a general trend nationwide in terms of increasing in deaths and serious injuries across not only the state highway network, but in other TA networks. So, I mean, it's important that we analyse, the causes and contributors to those deaths and serious injuries. So, unfortunately, when you've got lag indicators which are moving annual targets and annual 5-year targets, what you find is you get periodic spikes, which may be due to factors completely outside our control, and they tend to get pulled through in the data. But you can be assured that we look at all of those areas of safety and try to assess and understand where we might have influence over that. In general, what we're seeing is higher traffic volumes. We're seeing higher levels of and we're seeing behaviour in terms of our drivers. There are increasing numbers of feedback to council about the speeds of people driving in our local network. So council has very limited levers in order to manage those. We have a program of work which can target particular safety areas. So it will be a slow process in terms of driving some of that infrastructure and behaviour change. So, and you'll be aware that NZTA has targeted nationally its Road to Zero program. We've got a heavy request list in with them, something like $12 million for each 3-year RLT period over the next 9 years. So, but it will be something that will be difficult to turn around, given the nature of the sort of factors that we're dealing with. So, yeah.
Thank you. Final question that I had was around just one of the specific programs, which was the street tree replacement, which I see was a bit overspent in the last year. But sort of the general question is really just, are we keeping pace with our street tree replacement programs? It does seem like there's been quite a few trees coming down of late, and I just wonder about what the long-term prospect is around street trees and the resource that might be needed for that.
Yeah, it's fair to say the budget in that is totally inadequate for the level of, shall we say, historical asset condition. So as part of the long-term plan process, we'll be bringing to council a significant request to increase funding. Essentially, what we have is 14,000 trees in the city, and every year, 200 to 300 of those are getting to the mature stage and getting to the point where they need to be removed. It actually costs, thousands and thousands of dollars to actually remove those assets from the street environment. So we have a backlog of millions of dollars of trees that need attention. So $60,000 a year as a renewal program does not cut it. So, but we'll be bringing that sort of analysis and indication to the LTP process here.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question for you, Stuart. Hopefully this never transpires, but in the event that we are in an extended lockdown, we see a reduction in revenue and an increase in costs. I appreciate the need for wriggle room against budget, but my question's more around balance sheet flexibility, liquidity, borrowing headroom constraints. Are you comfortable that we're positioned correctly so that we're able to keep paying creditors, paying staff, meeting our obligations within our existing funding facilities?
Yeah, very good question. And in the short to medium term, very comfortable that we have a reasonably significant amount of headroom from a borrowing capacity against our balance sheet. Again, not to keep picking on our neighbours, but one of the issues Auckland's confronting is around that headroom capacity. At the moment, we have quite good capacity. Our debt to revenue ratio is reasonably. It gives us a fair amount of headroom right now. I guess longer term and much longer term, my concern is really around borrowing capacity, particularly if we're going to be building a wastewater treatment plant, and that really starts to have to bite from a long-term sustainability perspective. So yes, in the short to medium term, council's in pretty good shape. The balance sheet's in pretty good shape. We have pretty good flexibility. We'll be okay, I think.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's really when Robert's comments around the trees and the cost to look after them. Have we ever thought about, because this has happened with electricity firms that were looking after their networks, and they formed their own units after going to the market all the time and figuring out that they were spending literally hundreds of thousands on looking after their networks. Have we thought about our own dedicated team? I know we have a couple of people, but have we thought about our own team?
We do have our own arborist team who remove most of the trees when they've reached the end of their life. So there are some specialty occupation sort of activities like stump grinding, which we contract in, but generally most of the work is done in-house. It's just the sheer backlog of trees that are now reached the end of their lives.
So your question or comment back to us before is we don't have enough expenditure in that area.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, there are literally hundreds of trees that now are damaging our footpaths and our drainage and our curb and channel. There are also hundreds of trees that are now, need to be trimmed every year because they interfere with the power line network. So we're actually obligated to keep, cutting those and trimming those. And yeah, the trees they keep growing, they keep getting bigger. So you can leave them for 10 years. They just have got larger and they've got more expensive, to remove. So they have a life, essentially, an asset life. And while you can leave them in the parks for, a couple of hundred years, unfortunately in the confined street space, they need to be, removed more frequently. So.
Okay, thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. Really, this is a reflection of the stand-up of the asset management function with the infrastructure department. Historically, we've not treated those trees as assets. We've not regarded them as assets. Now we're starting to understand the residual life left in them. We're starting to understand the impending amount of funding we need. So we'll get on top of it and we'll start to manage them as assets through their life cycle correctly.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? There being none, you may step down, gentlemen. So we will move to the recommendations. There's only one up on the screen, so you'll refer to your papers or iPad, please. So there's two recommendations there. Is everyone happy that I move the two together? So I'll move and Councillor Naylor has second. I'd just make a comment that it's been quite a year for our finances. So I think to come out the way we have, I think compared to the rest of the councils in New Zealand, that we can thank our staff and CEO for the handling of this and for the fact of we're living in Palmerston North. So congratulations to the staff for such a good outcome. And I'll let other people comment because I know they're wanting to. So Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, that's an understatement. It's been a year. Look, and it's easy to sometimes knock holes in reports, but I do think on light of what has happened with the disruptions, the upheavals of the last 6 months, let alone what's coming, or what we don't really know what's coming, to be honest, this is an excellent result, and the organisation, the CEO, the officers do need congratulating because they've turned around what could have been quite ugly. Some of our neighbours around, when I say neighbours, metro neighbours especially, are suffering big time, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. A couple of points. I really do think it shows the strong health of the city and our very, very strong, diverse economy and the sectors, and our resident population too. The fact that our numbers around rates, rebates, or I wouldn't say rebates, rates, deferrals not being that large and being a small number tells us that our resident population is surviving relatively well. I do take that with a grain. We just don't know what's ahead of us. Couple of other comments. FTEs. I'm not going to get hung up on that. We do need to keep an eye on that, but I do think it should be acknowledged that the council here is doing a lot more work. I mean, we've just seen you can't expect all your revenue to grow, and it has grown quite significantly, and you're not going to have associated costs with that. So I do think we need to trust the CE and the management of her staff in the appropriate levels, but we keep an eye on it. I do agree with Councillor Johnson that we do have a COVID contingency, and that's probably wise. This is here for a little while, and certainly for the short to medium term, we should touch wood that we don't have too many upheavals, but we can't go through budgets and then find they're just being turned upside down all the time. So I do think it would be wise, and I'm not sure how that needs to be done, but that'll be the CFO's job to have a look at that. And I do think we are well placed, and Mr. Armstrong asked a very good question around, can we survive some more hits? And not that you really you do want that happening, but it does for the short to medium term shows that the council is well placed. Our Standard & Poor's rating is strong, our balance sheet is strong. We have got some big things coming, but in the short to medium term, the city is a good place to be with what is happening in the world and New Zealand today. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, just to comment following my line of questioning, and I think we just need to be aware that staff have worked very hard to get through the last lockdown, and we are looking at a staff that has not taken annual leave, that is potentially not looking at much increase in their financial salary, that has got a constant threat of possible lockdown hanging over it. And all of these things do have an impact on staff's well-being. As well as that, we need to be thinking about financially, we've set a very tight budget for this year. We don't know whether there will be further lockdowns. The CFO has commented that we managed to get through the last one, but it probably cost us about $3.5 million. If we have another lockdown this financial year, that will definitely be a financial hit to council. And so with the growing realisation that the COVID situation is not going away in a week or a fortnight, I think it does behove us as an organisation to give some direction around financial contingency planning. I do understand that there's been a good amount of planning done in terms of emergency management and what would be required in terms of the welfare response from staff to the community. But we need to be looking at the financial envelopes as well and making sure that there is that opportunity to reach into a kind of a rainy day fund if it's required. So I'm glad that will be considered, and hopefully we can hear more about that when we look at our long-term planning.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, just want to thank the officer for the report, and obviously a pleasing result for what was a challenging year. As acknowledged, the wriggle room that we have had in the last year with the significant interest savings has served us well, but I do also have some concerns going forward that wriggle room won't necessarily provide the same level of capacity into the future. The FTE, I do want to make some comments around the FTE count. I think, to be honest, it was a surprise to me to discover that we had a 10% or a 61 FTE increase. And I acknowledge that the organisation is doing a lot more, and certainly some of the commentary to provide context for that, such as some of our staff are doing what some consultants used to do in the past, is useful to provide context to that. However, I do think we should have more certainty about what we're expecting going forward. Our annual planning process is really robust. We know what programs will cost to deliver. That isn't equated into what that will look like in terms of an increase to staffing in the organisation until a year later when we get to see that retrospectively. That is quite unusual when you compare it to other large organisations where those planning assumptions are well demonstrated in the planning at the outset. FTE counts are usually in the annual plan, not just in the annual report. So I think it would be reasonable for us to have an understanding if we're expecting that to go up by 2% or 10% or what we might expect to see in a year's time. It does come as a concern to me that that is not a question that's able to be answered. And certainly going forward further than a year out, I don't expect staff to be able to answer that question because I think that will be determined by council decisions next year around the long-term plan and what programs this council decides it wants to proceed with during that time. But to look at the next year, I do think there needs to be an increase in transparency and a no surprises approach to that sort of information. But once again, thanks for the information that's here. It's certainly very comprehensive, the reporting that we get, and I appreciate that.
Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hadn't intended to comment, but I needed to feel like to bring some balance around the query around the number of FTEs against what we set out with our budget around our capital spend and our operational expectations. And overall, it's come in light of all the impact of COVID, pretty good. And so I've got a high level of comfort around that. And as far as the staffing appointments go, what that has shown is that with the transformational project that's been led by the CE and the executive leadership team, it's actually creating a lot more efficiencies and effectiveness of achieving these budget outcomes. We were having so far underspent in our budgets in previous years. It was a trend that was concerning that we weren't getting the output to achieve. And perhaps we were understaffed during that period to actually get that workload done, and now we've just caught up. And so I don't want to skew the outcome of this financial output just because we've had an increase of FTE. So I don't want to misweight the query or the comment in the throughout this debate. And so therefore, I just want to say that I think that's a little bit of a lesser issue, is how have we got this financial report is with the staff outcome. It's just really the results actually at the end of the year with the physical work's been done and to the financial performance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, this is, to my reading, a remarkably positive report, and I think we need to acknowledge the incredible work that staff have done to work through a very arduous year indeed, and noting, as others have, the uncertainty going forward as well. The point that I specifically wanted to raise was around how we approach our reporting, and specifically the reporting, and use that example around road safety. It's an area that there is quite real sensitivity in the community around. And to my reading, the written comment was quite brief and didn't really show a strong sense of ownership around that KPI as a city. In contrast, actually, the officer's comment, I thought, actually spoke quite well to it. And I would hope that in future, I know that this is sort of, in some cases, seen as sort of compliance reporting, but it is out there in the public. And I think we want to make sure that we really do closely consider how we sum up those responses around KPIs, especially in areas like road safety, to really ensure that we're supporting to the full extent community confidence around our commitments to improving outcomes in those areas. Madam Chair.
Thank you. There's no further comments, so I'll take both those together, so we will vote. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
Thank you. So that is carried unanimously. Right, we will now move on to item number 11, which is the update of Treasury policy, and we have Steve in the hot chair.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. This report, as you've seen, I'll broadly take as read, but I will make one or two brief comments. The policy is one, well, elements of the policy are ones that we're required to have under the Local Government Act. That's the liability management and investment policies. They're not ones, though, that need to be adopted through the 10-year planning process. They're ones that the council can adopt just by resolution. And we've done that back in 2017-18. So because of there being a number of changes to the operating environment at the moment, I thought it was appropriate for this report change to become before you now, and we can get that out of the way in advance really of the work we're doing on the 10-year plan. Having said that though, there are a couple of things that potentially could change through the 10-year plan process, particularly around the ratios that we use to judge what's prudent in terms of borrowing. And as we did last time when we adopted it in 2017, at that time in 2018 when the 10-year plan was adopted, we also made some amendments to that ratio. So I've highlighted that that's a possibility here, that we'll address that though through the financial strategy debates that we have in coming months. So the changes here that are proposed are some of them operational, some of them reflecting the changes that are happening in the marketplace, particularly to do with the structure of the Local Government Funding Agency and its extended capabilities and I've addressed those to you through some previous reports. Also reflecting, I guess, the way in which funding is raised these days in the marketplace, and there is uncertainty sometimes in the market about what's going to happen tomorrow. And the question was asked in an earlier report there about the council's liquid position, about its balance sheet. Well, obviously, the way we operate these policies is an important component of placing the council in a position that it can cope with what's before us. So these policies give the staff guidance, direction about how we will operate, but gives us also the delegated power really to respond quickly to be able to do things that are required on a daily basis. And there are some big numbers that are required here in delegations, but that's the scale and size of this organisation. And we have the appropriate checks and balances in place to make that all work. I think that's probably all I want to say by way of introduction.
Thank you, Steve. We're now open for questions. So, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Steve. As you know, every time this policy comes up, I ask about the policy around the proportion of fixed rate interest. And I note with some pleasure under 3.2.3 that of the policy itself, that you're proposing to reduce the minimum fixed down to 0 by year 6. Is that correct interpretation?
Yes, it is. It's what it's actually saying though is that the test about the fixed variable ratio is not just for the 1 year. It's about taking into account what the proposed debt levels will be looking out into the 10-year horizon, and so it's a different way of thinking about it. And at the moment, in terms of how we've been going about raising the debt and considering what debt, what are appropriate fixed variable proportions at the moment, we've been running against this slide rule as well over the recent months, just to make sure that we're positioning ourselves for the future. So it is saying that there's a different, more long-term approach to that rather than a shorter-term approach.
So do you think that that will give you more flexibility going forward? Because at the moment, I know we've been bumping along that kind of 40% lower, minimum level of the policy, whereas with that sliding scale over the next 5 years, I mean, you could choose to my read of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you could choose to remain at 40%, or you could decrease it if you felt that that was a prudent way to go. Is that correct?
I think the whole thing relies really heavily on having very good forecasts of what your debt levels are going to be in terms of that projection. And that's one of the most difficult things that we have in terms of the way forward, really, because if you look at what we're faced with now, and we're trying to make certain judgments about what those debt levels are, it's really, really difficult. And so to say that we're going to be a certain proportion fixed and a certain proportion variable relies so heavily on those forecasts that I've tended, and I've learned a little bit, I guess, through experience over recent years, that I've trimmed some of those forecasts in order to make sure we're not over-hedged and too much fixed as a result. But it needs then to make sure that we're continually reviewing those forecasts and updating our underlying assumptions when we're managing throughout the year in order not to become over-fixed.
Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, that was very much my question. It was around the change to the corridor policy, and I think what that means, you've answered that. Thank you. The other question I had was just clarification. Who are the advisors that you use?
Can't hear you. Sorry, Steve.
Should be on there. Who are the advisors that we use?
Yes, our advisors at the moment are PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Steve. Further on 3.2.3, just interested in sort of how those levels were arrived at.
They're based on recommendations from our advisors, and they've become a standard that they're promoting throughout their ones that they are using for local government, really. So they've developed this corridor policy that's become a bit of a standard, and that's the basis of it.
And how wide, are you aware of how wide the uptake of that is across other councils?
Well, at the moment, they're just progressing through changing those, and we're at the earlier stage of the group that are doing that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? There have been none. You may step down. Thank you, Steve. So, someone to move the. Thank you, Councillor Naylor and Councillor Johnson. Open for comments. I think this is straightforward, so I'm happy to take the vote. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
So that is carried unanimously. We will now move on to item number 12. So you're back into the seat, Steve. So this is straightforward, so I think we can take it as read unless there's anything there that you want to add.
Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. So are there any questions, councillors? Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, the Treasury policy referred to a benchmarking comparison report in terms of interest rate management. How frequently do you report that? I don't note it here.
Yes, you're correct. It's not showing that there is a benchmark report here. It is something we need to develop a bit more in terms of the way we report that. The policy, it's not being reported to you in the way in which the policy is suggesting at the moment. It's a work on for us in terms of what we do next.
Okay, so that will come at a later date.
We'll need to, yes.
Okay.
Any further questions? So that you may step down, Steve. And I'm happy to move the recommendations. Have a seconder. Councillor Naylor, is there any comment? There being no comment, we will vote. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
And that is carried unanimously. Right, we're getting towards the end of our agenda. So we're now moving on to item number 13, which is the ozone replacement. So we have Ms. Suma and Colin Anderson.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Ms. Suma, so I'll do a quick intro as this is my first presentation. I came on board end of last year and I am heading the business assurance function, which was recently established as well at the time. Now with me here I have Colin Anderson, who is also an advisor to our program, I should say, and he will be speaking shortly as well. So this program to replace ozone was initiated in 2019 with the initial focus being on procurement. Now, as you know, earlier this year, we finalised Civica, following which the program structure was set up and I joined the governance board as an independent advisor, but also to provide assurance over the program because it was quite a large one. So in the presentation, in the first attachment, which is the overall assurance plan, that document highlights the key areas of assurance we should be considering for such a program, which has been split into two key areas. Firstly, driving change, which is around assurance over the program setup, governance and management. But secondly, delivering change. So that's assurance over the actual deliverables and are they fit for purpose? So that could be the systems, the processes, the data, access, etc. Now, to date, we have completed the foundation review, which covers the plan and initiate phase of the program. Now, overall, the recommendations did indicate that we did have quite a bit of work still to do, but given the circumstances, it wasn't an unexpected position for us to be in. I don't have too much else to add. Happy for the reports to be taken as read, and I'll pass over to Colin before we open up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been involved in this program since you got down to the last two vendors, and I facilitated helping get down to the preferred vendor decision and helping pull together the investment case that came up to council. So for me, I've been on the journey for since December last year. And we've got to the point now we've had a significant disruption from COVID. We've managed our way through it. There's been a few challenges in terms of learning to operate remotely for both Palmerston North staff and the vendor, who is Australian based. I feel we're fairly well positioned right now and really happy to receive any questions from the floor.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a point of clarification. So the vendor is an Australian vendor. I understand that there's a team in Auckland. So how do you perceive the risk to the project of COVID delaying face-to-face interaction, the vendors, business experts being able to engage? How has that been mitigated, managed?
So they've got about 1,000 staff in Australia and a small team of like 10, 15 up in Auckland. At the moment, that team has not been on site down here. They're not at the phase of the project that those specific people are needed. The main experts that we need are in Australia. So what we've been trying to do is to get the remote workshops going on Microsoft Teams, video conferencing, and we're learning to change the style of the workshops so that they're not as draining. I think you people have all done lots of video conferencing lately. It's draining to be on it all day long. So trying to mix it up a bit, shorter workshops, breakout times, and constantly working with the vendor to say, is that working? Is it not? So I think there is a risk which we have flagged of potentially creating some time slippage because of the remote operating model. But at the moment, we haven't adjusted the timelines for it. We're just keeping an eye on it, and we'll keep reporting back on that.
Okay, so you're comfortable that the tyranny of distance is manageable in terms of this project?
At this point in time, whether if we had COVID come back again, I'd be a bit concerned. If suddenly all the staff had to disappear home again, that would be the risk for me. As we're operating right now, I think we're okay with the teams, on site in Palmerston North City Council. But if everyone had to return home again, that gets tough.
Yeah.
That's where the communication really gets challenged.
Thank you. Just one more question, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Specifically, in terms of selecting the vendor and the software package, I'd just be interested to know how we went about that. I mean, did we go and visit similar organisations to ourselves, and what sort of feedback, what process did we go through in terms of understanding what we were getting
CFO
into?
will answer this one.
Yeah, I'll take the heat on this one. We had a pretty comprehensive procurement process being led by our procurement manager, Julie Krupichka. So yes, it was very significant. We went for request for interest first and had 5 responses, and then sought RFP, which got 4 responses. So 1 dropped out through that process. We met and interviewed every company that replied to the RFI. In terms of shortlisting, it was a paper exercise based on the RFP to start with, and we did site visits to other councils who are using the product at the moment, and we also did some online visits to some Australian councils as well. So, I think we can give you a certain level of comfort that that procurement process was extremely thorough, and I was as surprised as anybody with the answer, because from the outset it wasn't what I anticipated. I'm pretty comfortable that the product we've selected is the right fit for us.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I have a question. The PwC report has several recommendations which have a mostly June, July, August. So have all these recommendations been taken on board and been put in place?
Yes, and most of the ones that are running late are sitting on my head, if I'm being honest. So just the workload has been quite high lately, and I'm personally running a bit behind. They are all in motion, and there's nothing there to be concerned about except that they're lagged a bit.
Okay.
So yes, I think we can catch up.
So I have 100% assurance that these will all be in place.
Yes, so we did accept all the recommendations that they had, and we've developed a detailed action plan to address each and every one of those. And so Colin and the Steerco have taken responsibility to action them, and then every month I do a review and report to the governance team on progress.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further? Oh, Councillor Harpeter, sorry.
Thanks, Madam Chair. What's the biggest project risk?
CFO will.
Maybe I'll answer this one. I think the biggest project risk perhaps is what Mr. Armstrong alluded to, in the fact that we can't travel and we can't work with Civica right now. Certainly delays from COVID, I would suggest, are a massive risk, because as Colin quite rightly pointed out earlier on, if we're all stuck at home, the prospects of continuing this are pretty hard. And of course, time is money, right? And so the longer it takes us to do the implementation, the more it costs. So that's the reality.
So the contingency is?
The contingency is we stop.
Or we carry on with our current system, or is it going to fall over?
It's going to fall. Well, I shouldn't say that because that's nasty to the current providers. The current system is problematic, and that's the reason we're changing it. There's an absolute desire to carry on with this project and make it work.
I understand
There's
that,
large risks with COVID. That's the reality. We can't implement. It's going to be really difficult from a risk perspective to implement a new ERP software. It's a massive piece of work, even if everyone's here and everyone's available. It's going to be very difficult and very risky to do that from home. And in my opinion, that's from my perspective, it's a time and cost risk.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
I think my question, thank you, Madam Chair. I think my question has probably been answered, but is there a point in time when our ability to work remotely actually ceases and we actually have to have Civica staff on site? If so, where is that point?
Yeah, I've done, we anticipated we'd be away this week in terms of our planning. And so they mentioned the workshops before. It's a continuum, I guess, in terms of where you make that decision. For now, it seems appropriate to carry on with the workshops and the discovery work that Civic is doing online. It makes sense. They seem to be working pretty well. And the staff within the teams will have informed me that they think it's a good idea to carry on, even if we are in lockdown. But there will become a point in time where we measure progress against anticipated progress. And if we're not meeting that, we're going to have to make some decisions about whether it's appropriate and a good idea to try and carry on. My personal view is we need to implement this well rather than implement it in a hurry. It's a much bigger risk to implement an ERP system badly than to implement it late. And so we'll have to just keep a watchful eye on it and make that call should it happen.
Colin, you wanted to comment?
Yes, just to support that comment, Civica have informed us they are intending to have a couple of Auckland resources on site virtually full time from the end of August. So that will help just in terms of general communication and getting to know the vendor. The other comment that Stuart made is I've been involved in well over a dozen ERP projects in my many years, and grey hairs attest to that. Every single one of them has troughs and bad points that you have to climb out of and climb through. And I've never seen one run smooth from end to end. So you've got to stay vigilant, and you've got to have contingency plans, and you've got to manage your risks. It's just part of good project governance.
Thank you for the clarity. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions? So there's no further questions. You may step down. Thank you very much. So we will move to the recommendation. I'm happy to move the recommendation. Councillor Naylor, open for any comments? There are no comments, so we will just move to receive the report as the recommendation. So we will vote. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
So that is carried unanimously. We will now move on to the final item of today, which is the committee work schedule. I will take it as read unless there's any questions. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Do we need to put the quarterly health and safety update on the work schedule?
It will be on the work schedule as a matter of course, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I am happy to move the work schedule. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hancock. We will vote. Oh, no one needs to comment. And Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
So I have 17 yeses, so that is unanimous. So that closes our business for today. So we will move for lunch. What's our timing? So it's 12:30. So Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, so if we look to get back here for I'll just check with the staff. I'm just not sure who's presenting. So 1:30? Okay, so 1:30 back in here for our